Hello. Okay, so today we're going to have a quick look at some of the neuroanatomy which is involved in the CNS. Right, so from the hub, or based upon the hub, you already have gotten some idea that of what the subdivisions of the CNS are. So anyway, we're going to start off with, so obviously you have the brain, and just underneath the brain you have these other parts, right? And this is all going to be quite simplified, but there are a couple of things that we can definitely get away with knowing. So this area that I'm going to highlight here is the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe is usually involved in planning, and it's also got some things to do in terms of just being a little bit cautious and inhibited, which is what we usually like to do as grown-up human beings. The parietal lobe, which I'm shading in here, has a function involved with integrating all of the sensory information which is involved in the world, and the occipital lobe back here is mainly involved in vision. That's why sometimes when you get smacked on the back of the head, you end up seeing stars. And this area here is a temporal lobe. It's very important in terms of memory and that sort of thing. So this structure here you will know very well as the brain. This is frontal, this is parietal, occipital, temporal. There are a few structures deeper in there, but we won't talk about them specifically today. This funny mushroom thing on the back here is the cerebellum, and this area here, it actually extends up underneath there as the midbrain, but we won't talk too much. We refer to that as a brainstem, and that can be divided into three parts: the pons, medulla, and this bit is midbrain. Okay, so that, and generally when we talk about the brain, we're talking about the functions of the brain. The brainstem is usually included in the function of the brain, right? Don't think that this brainstem area is not important. It's very important in terms of autonomic control, and so yes, definitely very important. Cerebellum involved in movement. Things you have to remember about occipital cortex is a visual area. The parietal lobe has things to do with integration of sensation. Temporal lobe is to do with hearing and memory, and the frontal lobe is mainly to do with how do I put it? Frontal lobe is to do with mature thought, just being an adult in general. There are some things in this area here, which I'll just highlight here, that are to do with motor and sensory functions of the body, but something that we can probably talk about a little bit later. Right? So if we just move down to the rest of the body, we actually have the spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord's a little bit difficult for me to draw properly, but really it doesn't look anything unlike this, with a piece of there, right? And it's actually got these rootlets that come out, and these rootlets end up forming a spinal nerve, right? And on the back of them they have a dorsal root ganglion. So what happens if we take this cross section and we look at it a little bit more closely? We will have the dorsal root ganglion with all the dorsal rootlets there, and a ventral root which is coming out the front of the spinal cord, that form together to form, right, a spinal nerve. So the nomenclature here is a little bit difficult, but this is a spinal nerve. This are the anterior rootlets. Oh well, that's really the anterior root, my apologies. These are the rootlets, because they're little. And this thing here is a dorsal root ganglion, very important, we'll talk about them, and that's the posterior rootlets and roots. So posterior rootlets, posterior root. So it's easy to think about it because anterior is motor and posterior is sensory. So pretty easy to think about them that way. And the spinal nerve is when you have integration of both motor and sensory controls. Now this spinal cord doesn't look very impressive, but it's actually enclosed by the vertebral canal, and it ends at the level of L1, L2. So it doesn't extend the whole length of the spinal cord, which may be something that you actually moderately surprised at. I'll just colour that in for a little bit of reference. Now I've drawn it in this way because there's a couple of things that we should say about it. This is a cervical enlargement, that is the lumbar enlargement. This thing here is known as the filum terminale, and it's an extension of the, I believe it's the pia mater that anchors the spinal cord to the end of the canal. So actually maybe I should do it in purple, because also present in the spinal canal are these funny things called the denticulate ligaments, and the denticulate ligaments are also responsible in holding the spinal cord in place. Unfortunately, I've only drawn you one spinal nerve, alright, but obviously we've got spinal nerves coming off the whole way down. Don't think that, you've only got one nerve coming out. That would be quite silly. Okay. So, and obviously this goes up to the brainstem and brain above it. But what's really important is that, so, going down here is where the spinal cord will be. And the way to describe, the way to go about having a look at the spinal cord is it really provides innervation to specific levels. We'll talk about specific levels at another time because they're predetermined when you're developing as a baby. So you might have referred to them, you might know them as dermatomes and myotomes. Right? My S is not coming out here. There we are. Now, dermatomes and myotomes, but that is something for another time, if this is just a brief introduction as to what is happening. Right? Now, what protects all of these things, and I apologize, I'll end up drawing over my diagrams here, but if I can end up putting in some features of your face over this in grey, maybe it might work like this, because you actually have the extension of there, so your eyes will be facing forward here. Your nose actually has some of the nerves coming up into the brain there, on the olfactory nerve. So you might actually find your head looking somewhat like this. It's a bit strange to see it all put together, but that is really what your body will be looking like if we're just briefly putting things in. Your ears here, because a lot of the auditory information ends up coming back to the temporal lobe here, and you've got some, all the nerves in your those are your teeth that I'm trying to draw here, but all of the olfactory information is coming through there. We'll talk about cranial nerves another time. But yeah, all the olfactory information is coming there. You can see why getting smacked on the back of the head now might cause you to see stars or something like that. Sorry, I didn't draw it, so should have, I should probably make sure that that's inside the brain, isn't it? And surrounding your spinal cord here, sorry, maybe I need a different color. Let's use brown. You'll have your vertebral bodies either side. So this is actually quite well protected. And remember that the vertebral bodies keep going the whole way down. You've got your sacrum, like that as well, down the bottom. And your spinal cord actually does end. This is a very important point, right? Because below that, that's where you take your lumbar punctures and all that. So quite an important point. I think the last minute or so that I have here, I'll just use to talk a little bit about the spinal cord itself. The spinal cord itself is a structure that runs through the actual spinal cord, right? So this is kind of like what a cross section will look like of your spinal cord, right? And I think I'll actually leave it to go into a lot of detail later on, but just to give you an idea of what's happening, right? This stuff in the middle here is known as grey matter. So grey matter is where you have cell bodies, right? So you know you've got neurons which have a couple of different shapes, but a basic neuron will end up having lots of sensory info coming into the body, right? And it'll have a large axon which will signal elsewhere. These other things are called dendrites, but neurons definitely look like that. So this corresponds to the grey matter, right, which is on the spinal cord in that particular location. And this area on the white matter is corresponding to axons, right? So this is grey matter. We'll talk in much greater detail about the spinal cord another time, but the white matter is where you have tracts running through, so where you have tracts, and you'll see that and become quite fond of it when you do neurology. Grey matter is where you have cell bodies, and we'll talk about them more specifically at another time. So I hope that's a somewhat interesting introduction to some of the things that you will see in neuroanatomy.